we want a picture of a future. And what we've figured out is that that picture of the future is actually very consistent amongst everyone that we've spoken to.
We actually have hit a tipping point on the planet at this point in time that all the things we're talking about are possible moving into the future.
One of the things I see that we have in common is the sort of the freedom to be authentic. And if we are interconnected and interdependent, which is another piece of this, then how do we be in balance with nature, humanity, tech, all, like all of that balance in relationship, and how do we celebrate that? And if we're doing that, we're not, from the perspective of Stuart and my work and some of the others, how do we actually have conversations so that we can bring that, because a lot of the rules and structures are meant to keep us separate in the current paradigm. And if we're no longer separate, how do we celebrate the differences and that individuality and the authenticity of each person and still live together and take care of the planet?
The soil with which there can be many emergent attempts that will seed future possibilities such that A, there is something in place when there is a breakdown, but potentially B, there is no need for that kind of a civilizational collapse.
And that's the reason we call it radical. It's the root of the issue is that we've stepped away from ourselves. We've stepped away from believing in what we need and what we want for one another, into believing that the very rational creations we've created are more fundamental than ourselves.
We've all kind of come to that radical place of something different must be possible. And we're all doing experiments. And now we're bringing people together to share the results of their experiments.
I want to be with the people who are doing something about it, who are in the planetary conversations where they're seeing emergence and creating the context in which emergence can happen.
When we describe in a compelling way a story of the future, the feeling, the confidence, the belief, the sentiments, the energy, all those, they actually carry, as you said, Jose, that's the answer also to the how. Welcome to Portals of Perception. This is a conversation about the future. What future we imagine, and how might we indeed facilitate a wiser future? One where we are not just successfully avoiding and averting civilizational collapse, but rather one where we enable multiple regenerative paths forward for generations to come. We are here today with core members of Society 2045, Jose Leal, Wright, and Stuart Levine. I recently was a guest on one of the Society 2045 Friday calls, and because we enjoyed our exploration immensely, we decided to do part 2 here on Portals. So we will also republish right here on the page, on the Portals page, that conversation, so you can have access to the origin story of Portals as we shared it there, and to the 5 dimensions of the future that we explored, the 4 zones, and that additional elusive 5th dimension. So let us get started, and let me ask each one of you to first briefly introduce yourself and share the passion that brings you to the exploration of the future.
My name is Jose Leal, and I'm co-founder of Radical and developer of Radical Purpose, a model of understanding of human nature. And I've come to the realization that most of the work that is emerging in this new space that we're all going through is emerging from our human ability to detect what is not working and finding ways to make it work. And so that process of detecting and creating is what I'm most concerned about and involved in. And that's really, I think, what brought us together, was finding ways to understand that about ourselves and how we each are doing that. So that's why I'm here. And thank you for inviting us.
Thank you. Thank you, Jose. Please, Kim.
So I'm Kim Wright, and I'm a leader in the integrative law movement. And my first passion was really sparked when my son was born in 1977. And I went from just being a person to being a mother. And that space of being a mother made me realize that I was responsible for the future in the world that my child was going to grow up in. It gave me a sense of connection to all children. And I spent a good part of the early days of my life actually raising children. I ended up with a total of 16 children living with me. And during that time, I was inspired to go to law school because I could see that the power that lawyers have to actually make systemic change. And I could see a lot of systemic change that needed to happen. And so I practiced law from that perspective for a while. And in 1999, I actually took on the project of transforming the legal profession or the legal system to focus on peacemaking, healing, and problem solving is what I said at that point, although it's developed even from there. And again, I see the law as a vehicle for making systemic change, and that it is one of the major systems, and people go to lawyers around the world for advice and counsel at the times that they're having the most difficulty. So that's my reason for being interested in the future and the vehicle that I use for having those conversations.
So I'm Stuart Levine, and I share with Kim the legal background, having practiced law for 10 years, which was a great learning in the sense that, I thought that this was the place to go for justice, for taking care of people, and for some level of systemic change. And I found out that it was not a context that I was comfortable operating in. So I decided to kind of explore elsewhere. After exploring many different aspects of the legal profession, the great learning of that was how societal institutions fit together. And I spent a bunch of time in the corporate world looking at that. And I spent a bunch of time in the world of mediation looking at that. And all those things kind of contributed to a body of work around how human beings might be in conversation. How might they be in conversation for the purpose of creating alignment in terms of shared vision for the future, and how to sustain that level of alignment through resolving differences and conflict which inevitably come up. And as I kind of grew and continued to do this work in many contexts, especially during the pandemic, I realized that some of the conversations I was in were too small for me. They didn't quite work anymore. I wanted to be in conversation with people who were doing their best to address the planetary challenges we had. And lo and behold, I get a call from some friends of mine at Society 2045. Hey, Stuart, we need your help. We've run into some challenges here in terms of creating a good, solid shared vision for the future. And so I jumped into that with a lot of relish. And then I just decided to keep going and jump into Society 45 because it was a group of people talking about things that I was interested and wanted to be talking about. Having said that, I just want to share that this past Sunday, I was on a program with the great poet, David Wright. And a couple of things that David said, and I'll paraphrase, and I think this is a good way to finish and why I'm engaged with not only Society 2045 conversations, but a few other wonderful opportunities have come along. But here's a paraphrase from David. Always be in conversation with things that are not you. Let the fear of that darkness allow you to live, knowing anything that does not bring you alive is too small for you. And you have made it too small. So I'll just leave with that quote, and thank you for the opportunity to speak a little bit, Aviv.
Yes, well, thank you for providing this context. You've each been on a personal journey, which the way I frame this is at the frontier of emergence and of change. And so what will be productive is to perhaps get an origin story of how specifically the idea of Society 2045 came about, and then explore some of the journey that you have been on.
Can I take that one? So our friends at Enlivening Edge invited me to do a talk in, must have been January of 2021. And I kind of had a calendar that was open because nobody knew what was going to happen that year. And, you know, we were in the middle of the pandemic, although we're still in, you know, like we're in that place of we don't know what the middle was. And so this guy, Jose, was on the call, and we thought, well, this is an interesting conversation, let's continue it. And the two of us started meeting and having these conversations, and we said, well, there ought to be some more people in this. Like Jose's in conversation with some people, and I'm in some conversation with people, but the joint conversation was very rich and very big, as Stuart was saying. And so we decided we would invite people. And then one of the people we invited us to actually do a presentation about the things we've been talking about. And we were like, oh, we don't have a name. We were all very, you know, kind of, you know, different people coming together. But they were conversations about the future. And then several of us are Star Trek fans. And there was some Star Trek reference and sci-fi, and you know, the idea of all the sci-fi being about dystopian futures, and maybe we could create you know, an actual positive future. And the year 2045 came up. I guess maybe it was in 2020 because it was the 25 years. And so we called ourselves Society 2045, and we showed up at this conference that the person who was presenting before us was Margaret Wheatley, and we were next. So we kind of had this motley crew of people who suddenly became an organization, and then we've been working together to refine that and say who we are ever since. So Jose, I'll let you fill in any gaps and tell him, well, you know, it was not quite that way.
It was pretty much that way, but I think the thing that came to mind was the thing that I bring to mind when I think of what happened in those conversations between you and I were how much we wanted to have an outlet for the conversations above and beyond the day-to-day of our own movements of the things we're doing.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I feel like we really need to have this conversation. And you said, well, the two of us will set a date. We will have these conversations. And if other people want to join us, good. Otherwise, we will continue having these conversations. And that was all the permission I needed to just say, okay, let's do this. So that I think the other thing I would add is it seemed that we were running into other folks that also wanted to do more than talk about their specific topic, that their focus on their own movements, their own efforts was being, was not enough, that there was more to be understood, there was more to do. And so that's really what was the conversation. How do we take this to a meta level of understanding of what's happening as an emergent part of our society that's changing? And how do we understand that beyond our boundaries that we live in every day?
That's a really important piece. It's that idea that we were all doing something, and but that there was this meta conversation. And I want to bring this in because there's also this conversation about there must be a model or some way to capture this, and this is where we started. We've moved along with this, but the idea of it's not two-dimensional. There's this sense that there's a three-dimensional, the growing and expanding and contracting kind of thing of different people at different places, but all of it being connected, and that somehow if we got the people together from enough of these movements, we could share the information, and the vision we created would be richer and more sustainable.
And I don't know if you meant it in this way, but the way I internalized the 25-year horizon, so in the corporate space where I work with leadership teams on strategy, we sometimes stretch it and look 7, 8, even 10 years in certain sectors. More 3 to 5, sometimes 10. In the origin of the practice of futurists in the way it appeared in the mid 20th century with the futurist society, they often actually talked 50 years into the future and more. The 20-25 year horizon is this compelling zone where it's beyond the quote unquote traditional strategy or even vision quest. And at the same time, God willing and health willing, we're still going to be around to realize what we're actually seeing today. So that's how I interpreted your idea, your choice of 25 years. Am I on the money there or not?
I think that that and Kim will talk about the origin story, but for me, that number, it's far enough out and close enough in that some level of urgency and current intention is necessary.
Well, and it's about as far as we can go out these days. I do remember I wasn't as clear because it was September of 2020 when we created this name, and the idea that things had changed so much in the year of 2020 that were unpredictable changes, that we don't know what's going to happen in 6 months now, much less 25 years. But if we look out 25 years, we actually see that some of the things are going to have to get fixed. And we can, from that vantage point, look back and say, how did those things get fixed? Or, what paradigm shifts occurred? And it is like far enough out to be able to do that, but close enough to think we may actually be around for that. Jose, you may remember the Star Trek connection. Yeah. But as soon as there was a Star Trek connection, I was in.
Yeah, because we wanted to find a point in the future that we could focus people's attention on. And that's all of what you're describing, Aviv, is that, right? 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, whatever the number is, we can put a place in time that we can focus on. And so that was the intention, is let's look at something that looks beyond the stuff that we're doing today, because the stuff we're doing today is what's miring us in this confusion about, is it this thing or that thing or the other thing? And we're all trying to figure out which thing it is. When we look at what we look in the future, we're no longer thinking about what it is that needs to happen today. We want a picture of a future. And what we've figured out is that that picture of the future is actually very consistent amongst everyone that we've spoken to. And so back to the question of the 25, I think that the 25, at the speed things are changing today, is the 50 of 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so that was the reason for picking that kind of number. And then the reason for settling exactly on 2045, as Kim alluded to a couple of times, is the fact that the Star Trek Enterprise launches for the first time in 2245. And so 200 years before the Enterprise launches was the intent to look at that date as a target.
Very nice. So we now have the origin story, and one of the things you've been doing is you've been holding consistently every Friday a Society 2045 conversations where you host different guests and you invite them to describe their vision of the future, their picture of what 2045 looks like, and perhaps the journey that got us there. So, and you already hinted that perhaps there is more convergence than not, but I will still ask it in an open-ended way. What are you mapping from what you are hearing from people? And what are some of the more or most radical, use the word that is associated with you, Jose, what are some of the most radical 2045 stories that you are hearing and internalizing?
I think that it's the convergence that is most radical, in my opinion. There are different ideas and different new ideas that I hadn't heard before, none of which I feel are all that radical. They're consistent, but different. It's the consistency and the similarity of people's visions. They're always about community. They're always about togetherness. They're always about breaking down barriers, the barriers that we've created in our institutions, in our society, in our organizations, in every aspect, I think, of every single conversation we've ever had. No one has proposed, let's put up some more barriers, right? No one has suggested, let's create a more intricate structure, a more rigid structure. It's always about openness and creating new, more humane, more human-centric type environments, whatever that is, the law, society at large, organizations, and so forth. So to me, that's the radical part, the fact that we're all on the same page. And as far as the things that stand out that are unique, Doug Carmichael is writing a book about gardens, and he envisions a future where we get back to having gardens in our homes and around our homes, and that we're in relation with our food, relationship with our environment again. And that to me was unique and different, but again, in alignment with the types of things that we see. There's so many more that are that type of thing, but I'll pass on to Stuart because I could see he wants to jump in.
How could you tell? Yeah, the one piece that really sticks in my mind, and it's interesting, Jose, while you were talking, I was going to use the word humane as the commonality and you used that word, and I think that's a critical word. But Ayelet Baron talked about how in her experience, and because of her background, she actually put numbers on it, believes that we actually have hit a tipping point on the planet at this point in time, that all the things we're talking about are possible moving into the future. In other words, many of the conversations, many of the things that we're talking about and that the guests have talked about are things that have been in the space. If those of us and all of us have been paying attention, for the last 50 years, people have been talking about all of these things. But the way I like to think about it is there wasn't the level of urgency in terms of planetary concerns, in terms of resources, in terms of climate change, in terms of people just being, kind of fed up with the way things are. But here we are, and Ayelet talked about the tipping point that we have reached and how all of what we're talking about is possible at this moment in time.
So the tipping point and she brought to focus concerns a critical threshold of shared awareness, shared consciousness, or is there a different element in the tipping point?
Yes, no, shared awareness and shared consciousness. In other words, there are enough people on the planet right now in these kinds of conversations. In other words, there's not something unique about what we're doing. There are plenty of comrades out there. I use that term as a choice. Plenty of people out there who are in these similar conversations. And to me, what's wonderful is that 2045, Society 2045 considers that we could be the, I'm trying to find the word, I can't find it, the repository, the place where people can come to because there are kind of an umbrella organization, okay? Kind of an umbrella to hold all the different movements that are going on currently.
So, Kim, before I bring you to talk about what are some of the radical stories that captured your imagination, the tipping point awakened in me something I haven't thought about for a long time. There is a piece I wrote actually in the early 2000s, I think 2001 or 2, and it stipulated a theory or an instinct or an intuition that we were probably in a 6% or a 7% awareness of that change, that this is 20 years ago. So, and the essence of the writing was that when we come to 10%, there is going to be a chain reaction. The 10%, now I have no scientific background for that. It was more a metaphor. Is it 11%? Is it at 12%? But there was an awareness back then that is very much to do with you don't need to get to 25 or 30 or 40%. There is a certain critical mass that develops that then activates a certain chain reactive process. So I'm thrilled that this awareness is obviously somehow shared by many people in one way or shape or form.
But just to pick up on that tidbit, I think that Ayelet has a background as a pollster. At least that's the way I remember it. And we actually asked some questions about, why does she think it's a tipping point? What are the numbers? What have you? And she shared that, sometimes pollsters just kind of make things up a little bit. It's almost like they do a whole bunch of they're not scientific interviews, but what's the word? They're anecdotal. They're more anecdotal, and from that they weave a story about their future and about what they're personal prediction is. Kim. Mm-hmm.
I'm with Jose, what Jose said about the sort of the combination. And one of the things I see that we have in common is the sort of the freedom to be authentic. And if we are interconnected and interdependent, which is another piece of this, then how do we be in balance with nature, humanity, tech, all, like all of that balance in relationship, and how do we celebrate that? And if we're doing that, we're not, from the perspective of Stuart and my work and some of the others, how do we actually have conversations so that we can bring that, because a lot of the rules and structures are meant to keep us separate in the current paradigm. And if we're no longer separate, how do we celebrate the differences and that individuality and the authenticity of each person, and still live together and take care of the planet? And so there's that theme that it comes up in different ways. So some of the people are interested in how do we collaborate, and some people are how do we work together, and what are these different models. But that's what I see is sort of as, like as we listen for what we have in common, which is, one of the things for us to do, I think, is, to be that kind of listening. Then that's part of what I'm seeing and hearing so far. But another thing, and this was actually, Stuart is the one who brought this to us, is this idea of, we don't want to be just talking to ourselves. And so go out and find a more diverse group of people. So, where do we find people in other cultures that are having these kinds of conversations, and how do those visions impact what we're talking about? Like if we're in a global world, not just in our little silos, then it's really important for us to know what other people are talking about in other places. And then, at some point we may want to bring in some people who completely disagree with us so that we can learn from them as well.
Yeah, Kim, you just reminded me that one of the guests we had, who I've known for many years and is a friend of Kim, was Sharif Abdullah. And Sharif wrote a book 20 some odd years ago called Creating a World That Works for All. And the line that I remember from that as most important is the challenge that we have is everybody thinks they have the answer, when in truth everybody has a piece of the answer.
And that goes to the point of really what Society 2045 is how do we bring these pieces together? How do we make sense of these pieces? But we'll leave that for another question. I just wanted to add to the tipping point, Aviv, and I know you're ready for your next question, so I'll make this quick. I think that humanity evolves at a fairly constant pace with every generation. The speed at which we adopt new ideas and we change the way we see the world is at a fairly constant pace. Unfortunately, our society doesn't change at that pace. Our society has become and is fixed by certain ideologies, by certain structures, by certain processes. And it's that delta between where society was when we set that delta, when we set that structure, and the evolution that we continue to make as human beings, that delta between what the structure affords us and what we as individuals now need. And that's the gap that I think we're observing. And that's the gap that gets wide enough that it creates the tipping point.
Well, let me stay with this last comment and then circle back to some of the themes you highlighted earlier. So you're observing there in what you're describing as the delta, a condition where something has been calcified in the system, in the structure. And that societal structure, the economic paradigm, the institutions of society, that they are some half a century or a century behind where the leading edge of consciousness is. I would propose that perhaps it was always the case that you'd had people leading on the leading edge, and that there are cycles of breakdown of paradigms that allow disruptive transition. The difference is that we are now facing a paradigmatic capture that's more powerful than at any other time, number one. Number two, we have at our disposal destructive force that we've never had other than since the middle of the 20th century. So unless we are able to facilitate with wisely this next transition, the natural regressive or retracing pattern could actually take us back to the Stone Age. And that's why what you all are doing by expanding that shared awareness and by practicing listening to sameness, but also listening to difference and learning to integrate both is so critical, because that is the muscle or the shared capacity that has to be foundational if we are to be able to address this delta. Am I perceiving correctly the way you're describing and seeing this delta?
Yes. Two quick points, Aviv. One is, I remember, and Kim, you probably had the same experience as I, in law school around 1970, studying all these legal cases, talking about marriage and the family as the foundation of society. All right. And we all know the amazing shifts that have taken place and what that looks like in the last years. And the second piece, if you look at the United States Congress today, you see mostly a bunch of older, gray-haired men still wearing suits and ties. It's like people are living in an old paradigm, in the chains of an old way of being, and we're in a world that's just so, to use Jose's term, so radically different.
Yeah, and more of them are lawyers than any other profession, which I understand is part of the impulse that both Kim and you were activated by to change the practice of law.
But we are still studying cases that are 500 years old.
That's extraordinary. Well, let me rethread to some of the first themes, Jose, you highlighted, and then you each spoke to, actually. It's this sense of community was the first word you used, the sense of how do we come together as individuals, how do we rediscover the power, the meaning, the significance of community. So that's one impulse. And the other is that sense of authenticity and freedom and liberation and the discovery of the fullest creative potential of the individual. And I think these are the two, when I tell the epochal progression story, I describe these two as the two engines. And what we're seeing more often than not these days, they become polarities, and the two are fighting each other as two ideologies. And sometimes freedom is associated with the conservative right, and sometimes it is associated with the left, actually, and sometimes community and family is associated with the left or with the right. It's interesting how those virtues are taken to represent on the political ideology side, be appropriated on both sides of the equation. But what you're describing, that you are hearing in people describing their vision of the future, those two are very important. So here is my question. Could you offer a little more nuance of what are the different stories that you've heard about these two? And perhaps even more critically, how are you now, having been on this journey over the last 2 years, at this point in time, how are you integrating in your own thinking, in your own awareness, the future that enables both of those critical, I would say, evolutionary impulses the coming together and the release and the freedom of the individual. How are you seeing these two forces to play out?
Well, from a perspective of community, there's George Lakoff, a researcher, now retired researcher at Berkeley, who worked a lot on how humans connect information in our brains. And he described it as a matter of being able to associate new terminology, new ways, new concepts with basic models in our brains. And one of the things he said about community was that we think of it as family. And just like family, we both love and hate. And so, and George would say that both the left and the right love the concept of community, though their definition of what community means is different. It is hearing people say community from whatever perspective they have. We had a young lady by the name of Rachel Kahn, who's working in the UK, developing a new community for people who are developing clothing in the whole clothing and apparel space, and creating it in a novel new way, collaboratively, and in a decentralized way, in ways where they're not trying to compete as much, but trying to work together as much, much more so. And that example is no different than many of the other conversations that we see. We had someone from Japan, Yoshi, I believe, come and tell us about how the culture changed post-World War II, and how work was a family-driven thing. You became part of the family. And then you are now, in Japan, in the case of Japan, you're now being asked for the first time to create contracts, employment contracts, which didn't exist before, because it was a word thing. It wasn't a legal thing to be engaged and work with someone. So those are examples for me of the commonality that we are all pointing to. And as far as the community aspect, I think the way that I frame what you've just said, Aviv, is human needs drive our behavior with one another. And the force that we produce in society, the force that we create to compel people to do things, to compel certain structures, to compel the type of organizations that we have, it's a breakdown of force as soon as our ability to wield our needs grows. So we, through education, through experience, through connection, have become capable of doing more than what the system of force allows us to do. And now what we're seeing is people see that possibility and trying to find a way to break those barriers to make that happen. Kim? Oh, or Stuart, sorry. It just looked like Kim was going to jump in.
Go ahead, Kim. Mm-hmm.
Actually, to fully answer that question, I feel like I need to go back and look at all of the different pieces and puzzle pieces. Like, for me, it's like Legos that have gotten snapped together and they've created something new. And then to be able to take it apart would require going back. But I look at our own community and our formation issues, and so, like, we've come together and we have these commonalities, but we also have that tension. And so we have some people who come every time and argue or support or whatever. We have people who don't come for a long time, but they're still part of our community. And like a family, that's sort of, like that is a model that feels, like, I mean, that cousin I don't like is still my family. And if I run into him in the grocery store, I'm going to speak to him, even if I don't hang out with him at a family reunion, and there's that sense of tension for us of, the freedom not to come and still be part of the community. And then the sense of community that is built among strangers coming together. And then and we invited Stuart to come in because we had what was probably a generational or maybe a values clash in our community, and someone like left the community because she didn't feel like she was part of our community. And so we wanted to look at that together, like, well, who are we? And, how do we share values, or what was the core of who we are? What is our shared vision? And that's been sort of our eternal quest, because it's also a fluid community of people come and they go. And, who do we insist on being there to have these conversations if we're going to, speak for a group? And so it's I think it's a microcosm of the macro of what we're doing out there in the world. That we can point out these commonalities, we can point out these trends of where we're going and bring these different puzzle pieces together. But it's up to us also to resolve what we must resolve, and let go what doesn't need to be resolved, and to explore that continuously.
So the internal community becoming, in a way, a laboratory for some of the visions and the ideals that you are exploring. Is there any other learning or insight from that particular element in the journey that you'd share?
This came to mind. I don't know quite if it's as connected, but of course it's all part of the same. So it probably is. When Stuart said umbrella, I had a visceral reaction, because an umbrella is more hierarchical, and I see it more like mycelium, and like, we're part of a forest floor of connection, and there are different trees and plants that are growing from the soil. And so, something as basic as the metaphor we use, and you're shaking your head, so you probably like that one too. But there's that old system where umbrella was the term to use.
I agree with the mycelium. I was just looking for a word, and the word umbrella came up, but it was mycelium is much more accurate.
So right there is for us the emergent wisdom of the conversation, is the language we use, the metaphors we apply, the models we build. That is some of the infrastructure with which we're actually enabling the future to emerge with us. Because again, going back to Jose, the delta, the question is, if human consciousness is here and the institutions, the whole society are down here, how do you facilitate that, the leap to that? Now, I'm the one that often says that the how question is a displaced question, because we actually need to ask first the what and the why about the what. And once we aggregate or unlock enough energy potential in the what and the why, the how becomes a secondary issue, because the imaginal cell in the caterpillar is not asking, how will I ever become a butterfly? I mean, if it asked it, it wouldn't be daring engaging with the process. It aggregates or builds the energy potential that then is unlocked or released to facilitate the process of transformation. Yes, Stuart.
Yes. One of the Doug Carmichael, who we mentioned earlier, in the context of garden, I think he summed up in some way what's at the essence of the transformation in all of these different domains of social necessity, right? When he answered the question, so Doug, what do you think is going to happen in terms of moving into the future, given the potential for huge breakdowns we see in so many of the large intractable systems? And he said, well, he said, my hope would be at a very human level is that when the food supply system completely breaks down and people, try to go to the local supermarket and it's just not there anymore, everyone will come out of their houses and look at their neighbors and go, well, what are we going to do? And the question of how they will be together, either they will figure it out and work collaboratively, or we'll end up in some dystopian morass. That's the key, I think, transformational piece for any area of activity. How will we be with each other as human beings?
Well, the problem with this particular story, that it wouldn't pass as a strategy in any organization because it describes a breakdown that leads to tremendous pain and chaos as the catalyst of change. And we know history is full of these kind of examples. Part of what I believe you are trying to cultivate is the DNA, the soil with which there can be many emergent attempts that will seed future possibilities such that A, there is something in place when there is a breakdown, but potentially B, there is no need for that kind of a civilizational collapse. So, which leads me to the next question, which is, what are you hearing from those different guests in the way they are describing their picture of the future, their vision for 2045, in terms of the relationship between the what, so the content of the vision, and the how to enable that and get there? What is some of the wisdom that is revealed through that tension? Because that is often where the tension is.
I think that the opposite of dystopian is utopian, and that has a lot of other meanings, and that we are not hearing from people who don't understand the urgency and the potential costs of doing things the old way. Like what there's a groundedness to them of understanding that other future, like if nobody does anything, we're kind of on the fast track to that kind of collapse that Stuart's talking about. And so I actually I'm actually comforted by that. We don't have stars in our eyes and and all that kind of stuff. We've examined this to the point we know that that's where it's going. And then we've all asked the question to ourselves and our communities, what will make a difference? And we've answered it differently, but that's perfect, because there is no one answer. These are wicked problems. These are I always use the image of a bowl of spaghetti. You pull the string over here and it wiggles over there, and it's sort of this morass of the unpredictable. But if each of us takes on our piece, then we're all in that laboratory. We're all in this learning community. A lot of people in my community are creating new models. I talk about it as we are creating the new legal system for after this one is no longer operational. We need to be handling a new way of being in the world. And this new way is more more about our interconnectedness and balance and community and all of those things that the 500 year ago and an older system didn't create in the same way. They were dealing with what they were dealing with, and so now we're dealing with this. We're creating, we're experimenting.
I know, Kim, this is probably a whole other call at another time, which we should have, just going deep, maybe with you and Stuart, about how are you reforming or proposing to transform the legal system, and the practice of law. But just to give us a sense of that, how are you approaching? Because and this is not my area of education and training, but as you alluded to, this is one of those systems that is precedent-based. So whatever we are looking at today is based on precedents of 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago. So we are always looking backward rather than looking forward. And I've always believed that the other implied message there was we do not trust our capacity to think in the moment about the problem we are encountering today. So we are always precedent-based in our inquiry. But so how can you give us a bit of a sense of what would be the first principle of thinking about a new system of law and the legal system in 2045? How are you beginning to approach this delicious conundrum?
You're pointing to some of it, like to actually stop looking back and start looking forward. Huge paradigm shift. And that's true in the common law system, but also somewhat in the civil system. So that's part of it. Putting the relationships at the core and the success of the relationships as our goal, and not what some third party 20 years from now is going to look back and say should have happened. It's more about our choice making and our authenticity. So, for example, one of the models, and Stuart was a pioneer in looking at agreements in a different way. If we're creating an agreement to go into business together, the old model has us look back and all the things that have ever gone wrong in a business get written into a contract. But if we actually are looking at what is our vision for the future, what do we need to accomplish that vision, and who are we and what do we bring? And we know we're human beings, and we know that we can get into situations where we don't agree. And what is the model we're going to put in place for that, so that we are responsible for resolving our conflicts, and that we don't just throw up our hands and say he's an idiot and I'm going to go sue and get somebody else to tell me what the contract meant.
So just to riff on that a little bit, it's agreements for results, future, versus agreements for protection about what was wrong in the past. But more important, the current legal system is, if you think about it, going to court. If you think about King Arthur's court, if you think about jousting, that's the origin of our current legal system. And there's nothing civil about a piece of civil litigation the way it's currently constituted. It's generally not about, quote, solving a human problem. All right. So the idea of having multidisciplinary people come and look at this problem and try to resolve the problem, and people not trying to win or be right or to satisfy their own ego. It all goes back in some ways to a shift in mindset and having people in the system acting with a whole lot more humanity
and consciousness.
So let me expand this and bring Jose into this inquiry about the way of the change, because one way to perhaps reflect on this is that the modernity project has been so successful. This transition from the 16th, 17th century, the Enlightenment project, and then the Industrial Revolution and free market economies, this was so successful. So what you have now is the result of a 200, 300, 400 years of a system that developed unto itself so much weight and bureaucratic heaviness. And what we are often looking at, the law is one area, another is the economic paradigm, where we are seeing financial systems that initially the exchange was an idea to facilitate the economy. So you had a way to enable people to transact, to facilitate their vision. But then we had these geniuses that developed finance for finance, for finance for finance. and the sophisticated derivatives that create trillions of dollars in very rapidly, which is the definition of cancerous growth, because something is no longer growing in support of its origin and its function for the bigger whole. It is now growing for its own purpose. So put this aside for a minute. So the conundrum we are grappling with is, what do you believe, what are you learning from your own inquiries and conversations about the mechanisms of change that will facilitate these various futures and future stories that you're hearing?
So, I mean, you did a beautiful job of describing what has happened. And I think if we look at what happened and why it happened, it wasn't because people had malice. It wasn't because people were trying to create a bad system. It was that we got to the point where we believed our own BS, right? We created a system where we said, well, it would be great if we had a system of law that protected us from each other. And now we believe that the system of law has more power than we do as individuals. We thought, let's create a system of finance that helps us be able to grow our businesses, grow our financial success. And then we said, the financial system is actually more important than the individuals. So the success of the financial system, the metrics that we use for the success of a country, the metrics that we use for the success of an organization, are in themselves more important than the results that created the metrics themselves. And that is, I think, what you've just described in a slightly different way of phrasing it.
And the bug in the system, one way to perhaps describe the bug in the system is those various structures and systems. They have unlocked so much power, and such that the people that are at the center, and again, it's not malice, but the seat of power in each of those systems is self-reinforcing.
Exactly.
And the more it reinforces itself, the more it gets further and further away, divorced and distanced from its original context and its first principle, which was it was a system within a greater whole serving the greater whole.
And that's the reason we call it radical. It's the root of the issue is that we've stepped away from ourselves. We've stepped away from believing in what we need and what we want for one another, into believing that the very rational creations we've created are more fundamental than ourselves. And so whenever any of the guests that we've brought in and any of the conversations that we've had, people start talking about this ideology as being the reason for what we're doing, it never resonates. It's always the presence of ourselves. It's about being aware. It's about recognizing our needs. It's about recognizing the common shared humanity. And that's the how. Both the problem and the solution and the how are pointing to the exact same thing. The problem is we stopped looking at ourselves and started looking at these ideas and making these ideas more important than ourselves. We know that the answer is to start looking back to ourselves again, that we want to live in a world where we are in community. We want to live in a world where those ideas do not take precedence over human living. and that the way to get there is to move from placing more value in these ideologies and towards placing more value in our humanity. It's consistent. It's everywhere, every time we talk to people.
And I want to point out that I think that something is there about courage, because there's so much pressure, societal, like everybody knows this is how it's supposed to be because it is such a successful system. And there are whispers around, well, this doesn't really work, but this is how it's always been done. And those people who are willing to step out and do something different are the people that we need to be listening to, and the people that we want to interview, because they're the ones who are questioning that and are coming back to, that again, it's the radical, it's that, like, this doesn't feel right to me, and what might be the way to do this. And we've all been, to go back to the garden metaphor, we've all been planted in different places with different professions and different communities and all of that, but we've all kind of come to that radical place of something different must be possible, and we're all doing experiments, and now we're bringing people together to share the results of their experiments. Or the status of their experiments, not necessarily even the results.
Yeah.
Let me just capture this property, quality you highlighted, courage. I'm interested to learn more about the courage that you're describing, the courage that you're seeing, the moral courage, the behavioral courage, the courage of thought. Because this is when Jose said a few minutes ago, we need to turn back to look at ourselves. Then, first of all, that requires courage too. And I sense that, who was it, Churchill, who said the first four virtues is courage, because without it you won't have any other. So what are you learning about the courage of the people that you are inviting into conversation? Let's just not lose this very important thread, and then we'll get back to Stuart, where you wanted to lead it next.
I just wanted to add to that, because when Kim said that, in my mind before she said it, I was thinking that really, if another way to capture that, and I love the word courage, is action. That everyone we're talking to is in the process of action towards something, away from something. They're in action, and I think that's the courage. To capture that is people who aren't feeling like it's a problem and sitting back and complaining about it, but are doing something, whatever that means. Sorry to interject, but yeah. It just resonated for me so much.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example, Aviv, and perfectly, your question fits perfectly with what it was that I wanted to share. So all of us have been speakers. All of us have been guests. Okay, all of us have been interviewed for the work we've done. So we can provide some personal testimony. And I'm looking back at my own evolution. At some point in time, I realized, the practice of law, this is just about taking care of money. It's not really taking care of people at some fundamental level when you get out there in the world. And all the other lawyers seem to be working with a little bit of a wink and a nod, making sure that their bank account gets filled and not their clients. That's also true in the political system, okay? This notion of communism versus socialism, it ought to be all about, so how can we take care of people and a governance way, and yet you've got one side throwing lobs at the other based upon some old labels and old ideology. So courage, okay? When I stopped practicing law, it was kind of like, what am I going to do?
Who am I?
Who am I? What's my identity? It's such a powerful thing based upon the way we've been inculcated and encultured to think about our place in the world as individual human beings. And over time, what has emerged have been some really interesting changes. I've stayed active, example, in the law practice management section of the American Bar Association, published a number of books where I enabled my friends to contribute all of their radical ideas. And so out of a stalwart old institution, the seeds of change have been planted. And I think that this is true across the board with all of us. It's funny, I just cleared my workspace and I had on it, the farmer or the seed never seeds the flower. And I think all of the people that we're talking to from different domains, whether it be fashion or food, are all planting seeds in service of humanity, and don't expect to have complete fruition in their lifetime.
So perhaps two closing rounds. I'll ask two questions and one at a time, and let each one of the three of you run free with these. First, your sense of yourself, the sentiments, the feelings, the sense of optimism and energy, how have these evolved as a result of being in these weekly conversations? How have you experienced the impact of those conversations on how you feel?
Can I start?
Please.
Sure. So this has been true in my work with lawyers, and I finally found it also for myself of not being alone. Like there's this comfort, and I think that courage actually grows when you're in a community of people who are also working on that gap. I had another one, but that one's the most powerful. That I don't have to do it all. There's that other piece of, wow, I've got to do this. That experience I have of when I see something, I think I have to do something about it. I'm responsible for this world, and therefore I'm the one seeing it. But there are lots and lots of people who are at work with us. We have those comrades that can help build this together. And I don't even have to know what they're doing. I don't have to call them we don't have to have a meeting. I don't have to call them every week. I just know that I can trust that they're going to keep working on this, and they're going to keep learning and adding to our body of knowledge. So.
That's a really good way to put it, Kim, because when Aviv asked the question, the first thought that came to my mind was the fact that I now see problems that I didn't see before, but I also see solutions that I didn't see before. And I think for me, the evolution from being myopic about the things that I'm working on, to whatever the term is in being able to describe the opposite, is that I've been growing to see a bigger picture of the emergence of things, and that what I've been working on, the emerging things that I'm working on, are happening for the same reasons that other people are doing it. Not because I'm smarter, not because I'm more skilled in any way, but because we're all called on to do the things that we can do. And that, I think, is what I'm most connected with. It's this understanding that everyone feels their thing is a calling, because it's the thing that they see. And so being able to see for the first time over the months, to see people not for the thing they're doing, but for the fact that they are the ones that are doing it. And that gives me a new sense of community with people, because Kim isn't the person working on law. Kim is the person who sees that law needs to be worked on. And that, to me, takes it away from what she's doing and towards who she is, and seeing the reality that needs to be dealt with. And that's a big shift for me. It's a big shift in looking at things as their practical selves, to the humanity that people bring to their efforts.
Yes. This is a powerful articulation. You are describing a way to see the tethering of an endeavor to its essence rather than to its second principal expression. That's very powerful. Stuart, what would you say from your experience about feeling that the feeling of that experience of being part of a 2045 inquiry?
Yeah, it came at kind of a critical time, in the sense that I had spent the last number of years in an organization called Warriors for the Human Spirit, which is an organization founded by Meg Wheatley, who many of us know and admire. But Meg was kind of stuck in the world is collapsing. And how can, and how can I kind of be a good Buddhist as the world is collapsing, as opposed to going out and doing something and taking some action. And so in ways I was greatly motivated by the thinking of two people, which gave me courage. One was Steve Jobs. Don't be trapped by dogma in terms of living someone else's ideas, and have the courage to follow your own heart and intuition. And the other was a wonderful quote from Banksy, the radical artist, who said, "Think outside the box, collapse the box, and take a fucking sharp knife to it." And kind of deciding that it's time to, lift the head up and not be so focused on collapse, but I want to be with the people who are doing something about it, who are in the planetary conversations where they're seeing emergence and creating the context in which emergence can happen. So there's a way in which I have been greatly energized over the past 6 months by being part of this conversation. And and it's been gratifying, in some way validating that a piece of the core of my whole life's work, these folks called me to help them move through a little bit of a bump. Yeah.
That's compelling. So a last question about your living practice, your individual living practice, and the 2045 living practice. And let me try and weave a few things here, because Jose spoke earlier about that actually what the courage is the courage to express in action, to not just have ideas, not just have visions, but to actually be called to what it is that you see that needs to be done. And earlier in the conversation, this idea of a utopian and dystopian futures emerged, and I'd propose that there is a third vector there to transcend this polarity, which perhaps we can describe and has been described as proto-utopian utopian or pro-utopian, which is the idea of prototyping a future that by being engaged in an emergent action individually and together, whereby we transcend this. Is it a utopian? Is it a dystopian? No, we are actually creating an imaginal cell here and now. And that imaginal cell in itself carries the potential and the know-how to unlock future possibilities. And guess what? If, as we follow the brief from Jose, if we turn back to ourselves and we truly engage in the conversations that you are engaging with 2045 and a whole network of people, when we describe in a compelling way a story of the future, the feeling, the confidence, the belief, the sentiments, the energy, all those, they actually carry, as you said, Jose, that's the answer also to the how. The problem often with how questions, people look to find the how inside the same space that is intractable. With problem, they forgot to listen to our friend Albert Einstein, who said, you've got to come to a different vantage point to solve the problem. So with all those awarenesses that you shared and the invitation to, it is for us, for each one of us, to respond to the piece of the puzzle that we see. And actually there is, as you said, an important element here is bringing the pieces together. What else would you offer by way of parting wisdom or parting inspiration about the living practice? Because one of the struggles of people is they leave a conversation like this and they say, okay, so what can I do today? What can I do tomorrow? What can I do next week? So what is some of the wisdom, other than they can join Society 2045 and engage in conversations? What else would you offer from the wisdom and the experience of your living practice?
So, for me, it's about surrender and sort of the earlier in my life and in the culture, and especially in the culture of law, action means striving and forcing something to happen. And so I've had a practice of surrender to what wants to happen and not forcing and striving. And that means there's an element of trust there, and this gathering of people actually helps me with that, because then I can trust that the work's getting done. What I said earlier, that like, okay, like if everybody just surrendered to their calling and the thing that they want to work on, then it would all get handled. And so I have to surrender to what's mine and what's not mine. And so that requires a lot of introspection. Sometimes it requires blocking out my calendar just to see what emerges, and not being so busy, even though like there's a part of me that just loves the busyness. And that's like the way you're important is you're busy. And like all of that cultural conditioning about being busy. I'm pushing back against that as well. I've written 2 books, but that even those are collections of pieces from other people, because I don't want to be the guru. I want to be the congregator of the ideas around law. Stuart mentioned being able to bring in writers and all that. I contributed to one of his books. The American Bar Association published 2 of mine, and then thanks to Stuart, we also have a 3rd one coming out, which is about trauma-informed law. And that's actually a system-breaking book, because there's a lot in the legal profession that we don't talk about the trauma, and I think that we're at a place, as systems break down, there's more and more of it, and that we're going to be better served by talking about it and bringing it out into the open. And so being able to write collect people, to have these conversations, to be strengthened by the kindred spirits, gathering the tribe, so to speak. I think that's what sustains me, and keeps me going, even when things look like pretty hopeless or like it's going to be too hard.
So I think I heard 5 elements in your surrender practice. It's making space. It's trusting yourself. It's allowing yourself to trust others. And it's employing some time writing or any other technique to source and listen to not the immediate or the external drive for action, but to the emergent wisdom. Is there anything else you'd offer by way of a brief to what you describe as the practice of surrender?
I think you captured most of it. I'd have to think more. I don't immediately see something missing.
Okay.
And then the other piece is really the gathering of the tribe piece.
That's right. And coming together with others that enable you to actually step into the depth where you're able to source that emergent wisdom that fortifies and validates the space of surrender. Please, Stuart, do you want to share something from your living practice?
Yeah. A couple of threads pop into mind. One is moving the body every day. Just such a critical piece. Exercise of some kind every single day. The word courage is something that's come up here. The courage actually to listen to and trust those quiet inner voices. For many years, one of my mentors was Mark Nepo, who wrote a book called The Book of Awakening, a daily reading. And I'm an accidental poet, all right? Meaning I never set out to be a poet, but one day 20 lines of rhyme came out, and 3 years later, I had 500 poems that I've been noodling with for a number of years. And this year, Pilgrim's Path Morning Practice for Seekers will be published, 1 poem a day with reflective questions. And a few years ago, I decided to stop reading Mark Nepo in the morning, that it was time to eat my own dog food. So I started to read and do a little bit of editing of my poem, right? But I'm a writer, and not that long ago, in a context not dissimilar to this one, someone said, so think about your mentors. Think about your mentors. And what I wrote down was, the synthesis of my writing and poetry that emerges from and through some place of mystery, I have learned to trust. And when you talk about, Kim, not calendaring and just having some space where creativity bubbles up, that is just such a critical piece. And critical thinking, the idea of looking and examining the systems that we're a part of, and whether or not that system is really doing what it's supposed to, or are people just on a continual treadmill operating in the old system. I remember at some point in time with lawyers, I was trying to do my best to work with lawyers and change that system. But I hated lawyers and what they were doing. And I came to recognize, no, these folks are just trying to be the best lawyers that they can be in a terrible system. And that's probably true in so many aspects of society, that people just keep spinning on the rat wheel, in a wheel that somebody else made up, and they're just trying to do the best they can. They're killing themselves doing it, and they're killing all of us by doing it.
And so what I hear from you, Stuart, is one of your living practices is poetry. but poetry is a way of stepping back from the cacophony of noise and coming into contact with mystery and with the essence of things. And I imagine part of poetry is the practice of distilling the essence of something, not using too many words, using the distillation.
It's a beautiful practice, because what I came to realize as a writer, all right, is that sometimes you need to fill up pages with words. And it's work. It's real work. And the beauty of poetry is just the core essence of something just comes right out, and there it is. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Beautiful. Please, Jose, what will you share with us from your living practice?
Well, it's a practice that's not intentional. It's a practice that I'm observing of myself rather than one that I've made intentional. And so I thank you for the question, because it's something that I hadn't reflected on as I have now in your question. I think I've become intentional or unintentional about letting go of rational thought. It's kind of interesting, because I always assumed that my reaction to people's statements, positions, ideologies was what I needed to confront them with. And what I've realized is it's not what I had the problem with was not what was their intention, but how they framed it. It's not that the conversations I have with people at their root, at their core, that they are different than what I feel. It's that the framing with which they see the world, the language which they use to describe that world is different than mine. And then when we have these conversations, we peel back the language, when we peel back the rational thought, that what we end up with is the exact same thing. And so now I find myself in similar conversations. And when someone says something that I naturally have that, but it's not that word, but it's not that ideology, but it's not that thing, I hold myself back and realize it isn't what they mean. And it's not what I'm perceiving. And so what I'm seeing in myself is this practice of not allowing myself to be reactionary to the concepts, but being in connection with what is underneath those statements.
I don't know if you would agree with this, but how I experience you describing this come across to me, I'm going to use a word, it's one of those constructs we use. I'm going to say it comes across as a spiritual practice, whereby in my framework, whereby you are refraining from being captured by the exterior, by the enclosure framing, whether it's language, whether it's behavioral, whether it's any other outer layer, and there is a practice of going deeper and deeper and deeper again, not intellectually as a first impulse, but sensing to the essence of the situation or the person. Sometimes we will call it essence, sometimes we will call it source, sometimes we will call it spirit. It's very interesting, because this goes full circle to some of what Kim was saying with the practice of surrender. Without planning, you are describing it again from 3 different angles. Something else that we are probably short of language, and yet when you say, I give in or I surrender the need for rational thought, that's a very compelling invitation. I hear this as being prepared to lead through the unconscious, which ultimately is an invitation to lead through the super consciousness that we can all surrender to, and then we can all become poetic. So there you go. I've just integrated our living practices into.
This wasn't accidental. We wrote it at 12:30 last night.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because we did so much preparation.
And we've just demonstrated that the ecology of practices that you all are cultivating are totally interconnected and complementary. So it all is working right. And it is a proof point that what you are creating is a prototype of the future. It's not a utopian thing. It's a I don't even know how to say this word, but it's a prototype of the future being presenced in the here and now through a living practice, which is where courage in the way we interact with each other and the readiness to step beyond definitions that held us back is so compelling and so powerful. And I'm very appreciative of, first of all, you sharing this today here with us on this portals exploration, and just the energy and the robustness of practice you are cultivating by engaging weekly. Every Friday, there is a space where for an hour or 90 minutes, you are in 2045 describing that future and working backward from that future state into today. So thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting us and for having such good insights into our ability to explain what we're doing.
Yeah, I learned so much about us.
Yeah, and Aviv, I just love the way you articulated this last piece about, practicing for something that's out there, out of some super consciousness in some way. So blessings to you for facilitating this wonderful conversation.